Welcome, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. Tonight we're going to talk about a number of different topics. We're going to talk about Syria, we're going to talk about ISIS, and we've also got to continue talking about the domestic economic situation as well, which is extremely important. And also we need to mention some police state developments here in South Carolina. A recent story that just went up by me about that, but we'll get into all of that tonight. Before we do, I want to remind you to catch Truth on the Tracks here every Monday night and Friday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Standard Time here at ucy.tv. You can find the show's personal webpage at ucy.tv/TT for Truth on the Tracks. And on that page you'll find a chat room, you'll find the RSS feed to my articles, all of the articles as they come up on BrandonTurbeville.com, and you'll find the archive versions to this show as well as a chat room if you want to chat with other like-minded people during the show. That chat room is open all day and night, 24/7, as well as the network broadcasting a number of very good programs all throughout the day and night, all week long. So that's the show, and you see why. But we also got to remind you to check out my work as it comes out on activistpost.com and the antimedia.org. And those are the two sites that I write most regularly for, as well as naturalblaze.com. But I would also remind you that if you're interested in my work specifically, to go to www.brandonturbeville.com, and that is the website where I repost all of my articles, all of the YouTube versions of whatever YouTube videos I do, all of the archive versions of this show, and all of the interviews. All of the other relevant information is there. Speaking events and so forth will be posted. And, of course, we have links to the books. We have the latest book, the last one I've written, The Road to Damascus, the Anglo-American Assault on Syria, where I discuss the roots of the Syrian crisis. So if you want to understand what's happening in Syria, I still recommend The Road to Damascus, because that will explain what is happening in Syria now, who's directing it, and the history of the situation. And of course, we're going to talk about that a little bit tonight when we talk about the ISIS situation. So let's get in on that already. Let's go ahead and jump in on that topic. I got an article up at Activist Post and, of course, on BrandonTurbeville.com, which is called The Roots of ISIS. And that was written on September 10th. And I should remind all the listeners that the show is being recorded on September the 18th. So lots of things can change in the course of a few days. Even the show is being recorded so far in advance. Unfortunately, you're not getting real-time information like I wish, but that's just the way we are right now with the setup that I have for the show. So, again, the show's being recorded on September 18th, but the article was written on September 10th, still just as relevant. And the idea here is this drilling up or drumming up of war propaganda, right? This idea that we are going over to the Middle East in terms of Iraq and Syria in order to destroy or degrade and destroy ISIS, or detect and degrade, I think was the term Obama used regarding ISIS. So we've got to understand what's really going on over in these countries and who is behind it, right? Before we engage in more military warfare, the average person here needs to be aware of what's going on. So we've got this masculinity contest on the right, who wants to show Putin who's boss, who wants to show Assad who's boss. People like the John McCain fanatics. I sincerely believe that John McCain is mentally insane at this point, right? But you got people on the Republican side who have this foolish masculinity contest, but you got people on the left still obsessed with the cult of Obama, who are into this humanitarian intervention, idiocy, and the responsibility to protect doctrine. All of this, of course, is absolutely bankrupt. It's war. It's imperialist war. It's always been imperialist war, and it always will be. So, with Obama, with the Republicans, with the Democrats, with the media, with the world oligarchy, repeating the words ISIS over and over. ISIS, ISIL, terrorism. We have to bomb, to engage in targeted airstrikes in Iraq and Syria over ISIS. We've got to understand what's going on here. So let's jump into ISIS. The idea of a moderate opposition is a fantasy, and it has been since the beginning of the conflict. Right? So we've got this report from the Associated Press. It says Obama, again, September 10th, Obama has told congressional lawmakers that he has the authority to proceed with much of his plan without their formal approval. However, he is seeking authorization from Congress for the train and equip operation for Syrian rebels, a request he first made earlier this summer. Right? That's the quote from the Associated Press. The train and equip operation for Syrian rebels. This is being sold to the American people as a train and equip operation for moderate rebels, but these people do not exist. All right, there never were any moderates in Syria. I can't say that enough. The United States, NATO, the Anglo-Americans, whatever you want to call them, have intentionally armed, trained, directed, funded Al-Qaeda and other related extremist Islamic fundamentalist organizations as far back as at least 2005. We can even go back to the 90s in terms of when some of this began. But the idea that the terrorist operating in Syria and around the Syrian border is divided along some type of extremist moderate line, some type of extremist versus moderate division here is foolish, right? It's a big lie. There is no difference between the two. We have the New York Times here. I want to see if I can find the quote for you. The New York Times back in April of 2013 was actually forced to admit the fact that there are no moderates in the Syrian death squad ranks. In fact, here's the quote. I'm going to read you the article by Ben Hubbard, part of the article by Ben Hubbard. He says, in Syria's largest city, Aleppo, rebels aligned with Al-Qaeda control the power plant, run the bakeries, and head a court that applies Islamic law. Elsewhere, they have seized government oil fields, put employees back to work, and now profit from the crude they produce. Across Syria, rebel-held areas are dotted with Islamic courts staffed by lawyers and clerics, and by fighting brigades led by extremists. Even the Supreme Military Council, the umbrella rebel organization whose formation the West had hoped would sideline radical groups, they're fibbing a little bit there, is stocked with commanders who want to infuse Islamic law into a future Syrian government. Nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of. I'll repeat that. Nowhere in rebel-controlled Syria is there a secular fighting force to speak of, right? Remember that. That is the quote from the New York Times in 2013. Now, we even had one of the Free Syrian Army commanders, Basil Idris. He recently admitted to openly collaborating with ISIS and al-Nusra. So this shows you that the moderate rebels are not moderate at all, because the Free Syrian Army is supposed to be the representation of moderation in Syria. Of course, the Free Syrian Army have engaged in a number of brutal atrocities of their own, of the Islamic fundamentalist variety. So we've also got this interview here that Idris did, and this is Basil now, not Salam, but this is Basil Idris, in an interview with the Daily Star, which is a Lebanese news organization. This is what he says: we are collaborating with the Islamic State and the Nusra Front by attacking the Syrian army's gatherings in Kalamun. Let's face it, the Nusra Front is the biggest power present right now in Kalamun, and we as FSA would collaborate on any mission they launch as long as it coincides with our values. End quote. So we also have Idris admitting that a lot of these FSA fighters have pledged allegiance to ISIS. In fact, here's his quote, same interview. ISIS wanted to enhance its presence in the western Kalamun area. After the fall of Yabrud and the FSA's retreat into the hills around Arsal, many units pledged allegiance to ISIS, end quote. So we have the FSA pledging allegiance to Nusra, the FSA pledging allegiance to ISIS, and these are the moderate rebels. Abu Fida, right? This is a retired Syrian army colonel who became a traitor and joined the Revolutionary Council in Kalamun. He agreed with Idris, and he said that, quote, a very large number of FSA members in Arsal have joined ISIS and Nusra. In the end, people want to eat, they want to live, and the Islamic State is, or they have everything, end quote. So, it's not just the FSA, of course. We've got the Syrian Revolutionary Front, which has admitted to working with Nusra and Al-Qaeda. The SRF leader, Jamal Maruf, admitted that that his brigades coordinate with al-Nusra and Al-Qaeda on a regular basis. So this shows you the level to which the Syrian rebels are actually moderate, right? Again, we also were told at one point that the Yarmouk Brigade was moderate, and that was as the Yarmouk Brigade was kidnapping UN peacekeepers, kidnapping humanitarian workers, killing innocent civilians left and right. We're being told that they were moderate. Well, there's no such thing as the moderates. So going back to ISIS, we got to look at who controls them, right? Are they just some strange shadowy force that comes from caves in Afghanistan and then somehow manages to do what the Americans took years to do, which was seize large swaths of territory in Iraq and Syria, that somehow they just popped up receiving donations from Twitter that somehow outfinance the money coming from the richest country in the world going to the Free Syrian Army. Somehow anonymous Twitter donations outpaced the United States Treasury and the State Department. That doesn't make any credible sense. Of course, it's funny, activists engaging in some type of action or in some type of politically incorrect speech can get shut down from Twitter pretty quick, but if you're a terrorist, if you're engaging in atrocities and so forth, you're fine. Your Twitter account has no danger, or is in no danger. So, the Islamic State, or ISIS, this is entirely the creation of NATO and the West, and it remains in control. The West remains in control. And this is what I think even a lot of alternative media people don't understand. They think that this is blowback. I'm sorry, but blowback is a cop-out. Blowback is a lie. Blowback is saying that it's actually giving the imperialist a good argument. So that's what we've got to bear in mind. Now, with that being said, we've got to move along here. So we've got 2011, and again, we can go back to 2007, we can go back to 2005. The United States has been arming, funding, and supporting groups like the Muslim Brotherhood and a number of other terrorist organizations to overthrow the government of Syria, to destroy Hezbollah in Lebanon, and to essentially undermine influence of Iran, the power and influence that Iran has in that region. And this, of course, applies to other governments in the Middle East and in North Africa, Libya being an example as well. We've had billions of dollars in cash that was sent to terrorist groups like al-Nusra, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, and the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria. Of course, ISIL, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, it's all the same thing. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic Maghreb, all of it, it's the same thing. If you look at the map, and I have included this map in my article, you'll see a map of Turkey, Syria, Iraq, Iran, Jordan, Saudi Arabia, and part of Lebanon, and of course Palestine and Israel down there as well. And what you'll see is in yellow, you'll see the corridors of terrorists, of ISIS. You can see that they've come in from Turkey on two separate paths, and you can see that they've come down from Turkey into Syria and crossed over into Iraq, where they've staged the seizure of so much territory. You can look at this and you can see that it exists in what looks like arteries, basically. Arteries of terrorists. And you can see that Turkey is the heart of it in terms of the actual shipping. But that is that's just only part of it, right? Again, NATO territory. Turkey is NATO territory. So essentially NATO is the heart of territory where the terrorists actually came through. Now, ISIS was harbored on NATO territory. It was armed and funded by the United States, by the CIA, by a number of other organizations. It was given cash and weapons by the U.S. and so forth, that it was brought in from the Saudis, the Saudi Arabians, Qataris, the other NATO members. The so-called non-lethal aid that the U.S. and the British sent to them included the vehicles that you see ISIS driving around now in Iraq. And they didn't take this gear from moderates because there were never any moderates there to begin with. We've got a part of an article that Tony Cartalucci of Land Destroyer repeats a lot, which is Seymour Hersh and his article, The Redirection, which was written in 2007. And I think that I've reposted this part of the article so many times, and so has Cartalucci. I think I'll just read that here since we have some time. It says, this is Seymour Hersh: to undermine Iran, which is a predominantly Shiite, the Bush administration has decided, in effect, to reconfigure its priorities in the Middle East. In Lebanon, the administration has cooperated with Saudi Arabia's government, which is Sunni, in clandestine operations that are intended to weaken Hezbollah, the Shiite organization that is backed by Iran. The U.S. has also taken part in clandestine operations aimed at Iran and its ally Syria. A byproduct of these activities has been the bolstering of Sunni extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are hostile to America and sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. So there we go. And as Cartalucci points out in one of his articles, extremist groups that espouse a militant vision of Islam and are sympathetic to Al-Qaeda, that is ISIS. And of course, ISIS isn't just sympathetic to Al-Qaeda. ISIS is Al-Qaeda. We also have, again, in 2005, Michael Hirsch and John Barry wrote for Newsweek an article called The Salvador Option, where they essentially talk about what Seymour Hersh was referring to in 2005, 2 years before he even got to it. So essentially the important thing to remember is that ISIS is the product of NATO and the Gulf Cooperation Council, the GCC, that goes back as far as 2005, even further into the 90s as well. So do not let the theory, the claims of blowback, cover up for what is a coordinated situation, an entirely coordinated plan. Don't let them pull, we had foreknowledge but bungled it up on 9/11 kind of situation. Don't let them cover it up with the incompetence theory, the blowback theory, because that's essentially what it is incompetence. No, this is not incompetence. This is not blowback. This was designed to work the way that it's working. So we have a number of situations where one that we can point to is that the terrorists have come across NATO territory borders, and that's Turkey, comes across Turkey's borders and has launched a number of invasions into northern Syria with Turkish artillery and Turkish air cover for support. And this happened again in the Kasab village at one point in the Latakia province in northwest Syria, over there by the coast, where the terrorists came in under Turkish air cover. And they also involved Israeli air cover. That might shock a lot of people, but I would encourage you to go back and read my article, Why Aren't ISIS and Al-Qaeda Attacking Israel? And also listen to my show on the matter, and you'll find out that Israel is heavily involved in controlling Hamas for different purposes. But you'll also find out that Israel is involved in supporting the death squads for the purpose of destroying Syria. You see, Israel is not as concerned about the death squads holding power in Syria as they are a nationalist government, and I use nationalist in the positive sense, the nationalist Arab nationalism, I guess what you would say, government in Syria. So you've got that. That was essentially that invasion that I mentioned in Latakia. This was Turkish air cover, Turkish artillery cover, and Israeli air cover at the same time. It was coordinated with Saudi Arabia and Jordan. It was coordinated with the Qataris as well, and the United States, of course, the NATO angle. Now, before the appearance of ISIS in Syria and Iraq, right, before the seizure of territory, we had European media outlets like Der Spiegel reporting that hundreds of fighters were being trained in Jordan by Western intelligence and military personnel for the purpose of deploying them in Syria to fight Assad. The numbers, according to Der Spiegel, that we were expected to see were about 10,000 fighters when the reports were issued back in March of 2013. Now, Western media outlets, European media outlets, they both tried to spin the whole operation as training moderate rebels, just like they're doing now, but the number of reports that came out afterwards showed that these were actually ISIS fighters, right? They weren't moderates, they were ISIS fighters. So basically, these Western media outlets have gone to great lengths to try to spin the fact that ISIS is operating in Syria and Iraq with an alarming number of American weapons, American equipment. And essentially, here, let me give you an example. Business Insider. Let me read you a quote from Business Insider. It says, "The report, a study by the London-based small arms research organization Conflict Armament Research, said the jihadists disposed of significant quantities of U.S.-made small arms, including M16 assault rifles, and included photos showing the markings, property of U.S. government." End quotes. In other words, there's a large amount of weapons used by ISIS that were provided by Saudi Arabia and the United States. So that's who arms ISIS. So we've got a few more minutes in this segment. We've got the ISIS attack on the Taqba Air Force Base in Syria, and essentially, if you want to delve into this for a second, we can. The idea here recently is the death squads over the last few weeks focused on the Taqba Air Base in Raqqa province in Syria. Now, keep in mind, at the same time this was happening, we were hearing this alleged public debate in terms of whether or not the Obama administration would engage in targeted airstrikes inside Syrian territory. But what's interesting is about this is while the United States and NATO deliberated about targeted airstrikes in Syria, and the Syrian government responded, the government responded by saying that anybody who engaged in attacks without coordinating with the Syrian government, and the Syrian government did say that it was open to coordination, said they would shoot the planes down because it would be an act of aggression. And of course that clearly is an act of aggression. But as this was going on, as the U.S. and NATO were deliberating airstrikes, it was stated clearly that one of the biggest threats to an airstrike operation in Syria would be the Syrian government's air defenses. Well, as this was being deliberated, as the U.S. and NATO were deliberating airstrikes on Syria, as they said that the biggest threat would be a Syrian government air defense system, what did the death squads do? But they remove that air defense system. They attack Taqba Air Force Base, overtake the Air Force Base, and remove the Syrian air defense system from the entire east of the country, leaving a large swath of territory unguarded against American airstrikes. And don't you think for one second that those airstrikes are actually going against terrorists. Those airstrikes will go against Bashar al-Assad, his secular government, and his military forces, because that's what they were designed to do from the very beginning. So, I mentioned before, ISIS is Al-Qaeda. So let's go through this and try to draw some connections here. We've got the leader of ISIS called Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, right? this is a guy you should know very well. John McCain should know him very well because John McCain hangs around with him. John McCain actually has more pictures taken with terrorists than Osama bin Laden. He's hanging around with Salam Idris. He's hanging around with Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, the leader of Al-Qaeda, the leader of ISIS. He's also got separate pictures shown hanging around Abu Bakr. This is the gentleman who cut out the heart of a Syrian soldier and then ate it for the camera. So John McCain has quite the interesting group of friends here. But we've got an article from VoltaireNet, Thierry Masson of VoltaireNet, who is very credible, has been very credible for some time, put out some of the most real and relevant information and timely information over the last 10 years especially. But here's what we've got from Voltaire. This was written by Voltaire. In fact, we don't even have time to read all the way through it, so I'll try to sum it up. The short bio of Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi as it goes. Baghdadi is an Iraqi who joined Al-Qaeda in order to fight against not the Americans, but Saddam Hussein. Now, during the U.S. invasion, he sort of distinguished himself by engaging in a number of terrorist acts against Shiites and Christians. One of those acts was taking over the Baghdad Cathedral, and by essentially just ushering in this Islamic reign of terror, complete with Islamic courts and death sentences and public slaughterings, all that kind of stuff. After Paul Bremer left Iraq as the overseer there, Baghdadi was arrested. He was sent to Camp Bucca from 2005 to 2009. This was a 4-year period that he stayed at Camp Bucca. And the Al-Qaeda and Iraq forces merged with the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, right? So when he gets out, when he comes back, he's a graduate of the terrorist camp. The torture camps, the American torture camp system. And the only way you can get out of there is either in a body bag or with marching orders. And he apparently came out with marching orders. So he comes out in 2010. He was named the Emir of the IEI, the Islamic Emirate of Iraq. Remember, this is the combination of Al-Qaeda in Iraq and the Islamic Emirate of Iraq. So after the U.S. troops largely left, they didn't leave completely, but after the occupation was reduced to a smaller amount of troops, he began staging operations against the government of Maliki, who he accused of working with Iran. And of course he was working with Iran, not as a servant of Iran, but he was working with Iran, and that should have been encouraged. So in 2013, Baghdadi vows allegiance to Al-Qaeda. Of course, this is the same group he's a member of. He's leading it. He takes off with this group to Syria, and he calls it the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, IEIL, right? So there is apparently some question of authority between him and Zawahiri, and but this is, of course, largely for show, right? This is the IEIL, so he has these connections with Al-Nusra Front, right? After all of this, it becomes the Al-Nusra Front, and it sometimes boggles the mind how these things connect. Anyway, we're going to clarify this again. We'll go back through the Baghdadi story, and we'll clarify the connections between the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and Al-Qaeda in Iraq and ISIS and ISIL and all that kind of stuff in a minute once we get back from the break. So, ladies and gentlemen, this is Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. Stay with us. We'll be right back after this.
Members are on the campaign trail preparing for midterm elections. While many Americans say they're fed up with Congress, analysts say there's going to be a low voter turnout. Congress has the lowest approval rating in history. According to a Gallup poll, it is at 13%. Americans will have a chance to vote members out of office, but it seems many Americans are going to stay home instead of vote for the midterm elections. Analysts say voter apathy has been a growing trend in America and is expected this election cycle.
I think it's like everywhere. Like, people just don't think their vote makes a difference, and they see the same old people coming in the same old time and not doing anything.
Reports show voter turnout across all ages has been declining, so much so the United States now has an average the lowest voter turnout. According to the Center for the Study for the American Electorate, 14% of eligible U.S. voters have cast ballots in the first 25 statewide primaries this year. The study shows about 18 million out of about 122 million voters eligible to cast ballots actually made a choice for the U.S. senator or governor in primaries so far this year.
I think today's Congress is a perfect example of the necessity for term limits. They simply stay in too long. 10 years, 20 years, 30 years. And I think if people knew they wouldn't be there forever, they'd be more inclined to vote.
Meantime, the number of Americans who approve of their own representative in Congress has reached an all-time low. In a recent poll, 51% of Americans said they disapprove of the way their own representative in Congress is handling his or her own job. Ashante Hathaway, Press TV, Washington.
Welcome back, ladies and gentlemen, to Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville, your host. So before the break, we were discussing the roots of ISIS, and I want to go ahead and jump back into this. We were discussing Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, who is the leader of ISIS and who was the leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who merged that group with the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and worked with al-Nusra Front in Syria, which is essentially the same group as the Islamic Emirate of Iraq. So again, let me try to sum this up. Abu Bakr al-Baghdadi, member of Al-Qaeda, in Iraq, leader of Al-Qaeda in Iraq, who merged with some more fighters and became the leader of the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, and then moved into Syria to continue his jihad, where he called it the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant, as well as al-Nusra Front. And this merged into the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant, which merged into the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham, or the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria, which is now the Islamic State. So I understand this is a lot for some people to keep in mind, but just remember that all of these groups that I named, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, the Islamic Emirate, Emirate of Iraq, al-Nusra Front, ISIS, ISIL, IEIL, all of this, it's all the same group, as I've just described. So all of that should be remembered for the discussion we're going to have in coming moments here when we move a little further with this. But just to point out who is controlling the ISIS terrorists, right? We had a death squad fighter, an ISIS fighter specifically, who was captured by the Syrian army and was subsequently interrogated by the army, and he was captured as he was following the movements of some of the Free Syrian Army men, and he was asked why he was doing that and who gave him the orders to do so. And this death squad fighter responded as the following. Here, I'll read you some of the excerpt of the interrogation, and he says, the interrogator asked him, why do you, and meaning ISIS, monitor the movement of the Free Syrian Army? And the death squad fighter says, I don't know exactly why, but we received orders from ISIS command. And the interrogator asked him, who among ISIS gave the orders? And the death squad fighter says, Prince Abdul Rahman al-Faisal, who is also known as Abu Fazal. Now, for those of you who don't know, that is a member of the Saudi royal family. So essentially what he's saying is that the Saudi royal family, Abu Faisal, Rahman al-Faisal, is giving orders to ISIS death squad fighters, right? even organizations like Newsweek, what's called now the Daily Beast, has not been able to ignore some of the facts surrounding the Saudis' involvement with the organization of terrorist groups all across the country. So remember, as I just mentioned a second ago, we have VoltaireNet describing al-Nusra, which is a documented al-Qaeda connected group, as an extension of the Islamic Emirate of Iraq, which itself was nothing more than a version of al-Qaeda in Iraq. So in other words, from al-Qaeda in Iraq came the IEI, which then became the IEIL, which then became ISIS and ISIL, which is now referred to as the Islamic State. So, last time, for those of you who may have missed it, al-Nusra equals al-Qaeda equals the Islamic Emirate of Iraq equals the Islamic Emirate of Iraq and the Levant equals the Islamic State of Iraq and the Levant equals the Islamic State of Iraq and Sham equals the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria equals the Islamic State. So it's all the same group. I think my article demonstrates that, and hopefully I've conveyed that accurately enough on the show, on this recording. So there we have it. All of this question over moderate rebels, you should see clearly that there are no moderate rebels. And again, look into the history of the Free Syrian Army, and you'll see for a fact that these guys commit just as many atrocities when they existed, because the Free Syrian Army has all but gone. There are a few token leaders who remain in Syria, but most of them, even Salam Idris, is now in Europe, either in Europe or Qatar. He's not even in Syria anymore, the leader. These guys are nothing but a few officials in offices simply remaining for the propaganda purposes of having a physical body to claim that there is a moderate opposition. And of course there isn't. So we don't really have time to go out and discuss how Al-Qaeda itself was created back in the 1970s by Zbigniew Brzezinski and his crew, but we'll do that some other time in the future. In fact, I think I've discussed a lot of that information here on this show, so you can go check the archives and see what you can find about that. So, of course, the last time I recorded the show, we were just a few days away from the Obama speech to the nation, this incredibly ridiculous speech where he says, let's just try to recap the Obama statement before we get into anything further, right? We heard Obama September 10th saying that he has reserved the right to engage in airstrikes inside Syria. He said he had a 4-point strategy that would degrade and ultimately destroy ISIS. He said that, quote, if left unchecked, ISIS could prove a threat across the Middle Eastern region, end quote, and possibly the American homeland. He warned that ISIS terrorists originating from the United States and Europe could return home and engage in terrorist attacks on American and European soil. This is something I've discussed here on this show, and I want you to please remember that if this does happen, if ISIS does engage in terror attacks here on the United States soil, particularly of the nuclear variety, always remember that it wasn't Muslim immigrants that did it. It wasn't domestic terrorists that worked with them. It was the U.S. government. It was NATO, because they are responsible for funding these terrorist organizations. They are responsible for arming them, and they are responsible for directing them. So always remember who the guilty party is, and don't let emotion or panic or fear sway you from understanding and calling out who the real terrorists and criminals are. So that being said, let's get back to the Obama speech. Obama also announced a plan to create a broad coalition to roll back what he called the terrorist threat. And here is the 4-point plan. Basically, one, it was to create a systematic campaign of airstrikes against terrorists in Iraq, as well as a plan to work with the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military forces. We've discussed some of that. To increase support to U.S. forces fighting ISIL on the ground. To increase support to forces fighting ISIL on the ground. This will take the form of 475 additional U.S. service members. We have Obama claims that these troops will not have a combat mission, but instead an advisory role. Obama stated his intention to increase assistance to Syrian death squad fighters fighting against Bashar al-Assad. So We'll come back to that. Number 3, increase counterterrorism efforts, cut off funding to terrorist groups, and improve intelligence on the ground. He wanted to convene a meeting in the UN Security Council in 2 weeks to discuss these matters. And 4, increase humanitarian assistance to the victims of the crisis in Iraq and Syria. Well, let's take these points 1 through 4 and discuss them briefly. So we have the systematic campaign of airstrikes against terrorists in Iraq, and a plan to work with the Iraqi government and the Iraqi military forces. Okay, well, good. Work with the Iraqi government. Work with the Iraqi military forces. We do not support bombing. On this show, I do not support bombing. I do not support airstrikes. Why? Because you created the damn problem. You want to stop it, you stop funding it. So the solution, of course, is not military involvement. It's not airstrikes. It's working with the Iraqis, and above all, working with Assad. Assad is your best friend. He is the worst enemy of terrorists. He's killed more terrorists in 1 week than the United States has killed in its history. So the solution would be to work with Assad, to work with the Iraqi government, and to exchange intelligence and information and coordinates with the location of the death squads and any possible remaining straggling fighters. Also, to immediately demand to Saudi Arabia, to the Qataris, and any other Gulf state feudal monarchies engaged in funding and directing these terrorists, to stop it. Immediately stop funding these terrorists. So those are the solutions. You'll be done with terrorism in a day. Let's see, number 2, increase support forces fighting ISIL on the ground. Well, again, that's what I just said. No more troops. Additional 475 troops is what Obama has said he's going to send. Our solution, no troops. All right, we've got the idea that he's going to create assistance to death squad fighters fighting against Bashar al-Assad. Again, you can read my analysis of this statement that he made in the article entitled Obama's Speech to America, Stop ISIL by Funding ISIL. Remember what I just said in this entire radio broadcast, which is that there are no moderates in Syria. So if you're funding opposition fighters against Assad, you are funding ISIS. So in other words, it's openly stated that the United States is funding ISIS to fight against Assad. We are not fighting ISIS, we're funding them. So that is point 2. We have counterterrorism efforts, cut off funding. It's all BS. They're not cutting off funding. They're increasing funding. We just announced $5 million, I think maybe $5 million or $5 billion to go to terrorists in Syria. And of course the humanitarian assistance. Generally there is no humanitarian assistance. It's fake humanitarian groups like Doctors Without Borders and so forth, which actually provide health care and emergency medical help to terrorists, right? And we can go into that at some point in the future. So we've got Obama saying that he will not hesitate to take action against ISIL. It is the authority to combat ISIL, believes the country is stronger when Congress is consulted. Now, keep in mind he didn't say when Congress is asked. He just says when Congress is consulted. The Freudian slip there. I made a couple of those tonight. So this was essentially, Obama's speech was nothing but psychopathic insanity, right? That 4-point plan is full of nothing but deceit and contradictions. Obama's statement regarding ISIS in Iraq, ISIS in Syria, it's a thinly masked lie covering up the goal of launching airstrikes against Assad. And despite all of the airstrikes taking place in Iraq, and those that are going to take place in the future, always remember that they're entirely, the ISIS is entirely the creation of the United States and NATO. When the airstrikes began in Iraq, they took place in Erbil. That was to protect the oil fields. Don't make the mistake of thinking that we are actually, when I say we, I mean NATO and the United States are actually fighting terrorism. They're not. They're funding it. So that is the question there. That is the article, the issue surrounding Syria and Obama's Orwellian statement. We're going to stop ISIL by funding ISIL, and that is, without a doubt, the position of the U.S. government. Stop ISIL, by funding ISIL. Only the Americans, only in America can you get away with something like that. I guess that's not fair. It's not only in America, but it seems the level of propaganda needed to goad the American people into moving along like sheep is not is getting lower and lower. It doesn't require the technical assistance that it used to. So we've also got this article by myself up at Activist Post and BrandonTurbeville.com. Military source: troops on the ground in Syria absolutely crucial to defeat ISIS. Remember, Obama said no troops in Syria, no troops in Iraq, immediately announced 475 troops in Iraq. Remember, he said that before he sent in about 1,200 troops to Iraq. And of course, this lie that Obama ended the war in Iraq was patently false, because there were 50,000 troops still left in Iraq on a stay-behind mission to begin with, so we can't forget that. But we have the military source. We have a senior Air Force commander speaking to USA Today, saying that boots on the ground will indeed be needed inside Syria to combat ISIS. Right? He says that it's absolutely crucial that pilots are talking to an American on the ground who can provide on-the-ground assistance with identification of the targets. So we also heard during the so-called debate over the congressional decision to arm, train, and fund ISIS again, that General Martin Dempsey stated that he thinks that this cannot be done without troops on the ground, that Obama is has asked him to come back to him regularly and give him an update on the situation. So it looks like we are moving toward the ground troop deployment in Iraq and Syria. So we can't of course move much further without talking about the decision by the U.S. House to vote for the authorization to arm and train death squads in Syria and to essentially use military force. Of course, the U.S. House votes for this bill, this amendment. It was actually an amendment added to defense spending. Well, not a defense spending bill, but a bill that would have kept the country funded, kept the U.S. federal government funded. But the House of Representatives votes for this bill for one or two reasons. A, because their handlers told them to do it, and because the Congress has to make itself seem relevant. Remember, Obama assumed authority himself. This was a rubber stamp because Congress is largely irrelevant, and it knows that it's irrelevant. Now, we're coming up on the end of the show, and I've got to get a couple of things out first. I am not a fan of Representative Justin Amash by any means, but there was a good article up at Activist Post. It was essentially Amash's statement. It's Representative Amash says ISIS mission amendment plainly advances regime change in Syria. And this is what Amash has to say, and I'll go through this quick. The amendment's focus, arming groups fighting the Assad government in Syria, has little to do with defeating ISIS. The mission that the amendment advances plainly isn't the defeat of ISIS, it's the defeat of Assad. What have I been saying on this show for the last few months? The goal isn't to defeat terrorism, it's to use terrorism as a justification to defeat Assad. And that's exactly what Amash is saying here. Let me read another quote from him. The Obama administration has tried to rally support for U.S. involvement in the Civil War by implying that our help would be at arm's length. The amendment Congress will vote on broadly authorizes assistance to groups in Syria. It does not specify what types of weapons our government will give the groups. It does not prohibit boots on the ground. The amendment is silent on the President's power to order our troops to fight in the Civil War. It states only that Congress doesn't provide specific statutory authorization for such escalation. It does not state the financial cost of the war. So that's, he goes on, if the Syrian groups that are appropriately vetted, the amendment's language, succeed and oust Assad, what could result? Would the groups assemble a coalition government of anti-Assad fighters, and would that coalition include ISIS? What would happen to the Alawites and Christians who stood with Assad? To what extent would the U.S. government be obligated to occupy Syria to rebuild the government? If each of these groups went its own way, would Syria's territory be broken apart? And if so, would ISIS control one of the resulting countries? All good questions from Justin Amash. And of course, the U.S. House did vote to approve that measure, that amendment, because, as I said, the U.S. The U.S. Congress is attempting to show that it's not irrelevant, to show that it is, in a sense, rushing to jump ahead and saying, we'll vote on it, despite the fact that you said we don't have essentially any authority. We'll vote on it and give you what you want so we can have the pretense of giving you permission. In other words, well, yeah, you can have my lunch, but I didn't want it anyway. That's kind of essentially what's going on here. But also remember that Congress is owned by big corporations, by big banks, by other special interests. And these groups, of course, direct their little ignorant puppets in Congress. So don't think that the relevance was the only reason that Congress voted to support this amendment. Big banks want this conflict. Big corporations want this conflict. And, of course, the secret societies involved in guiding these types of conflicts want to see the conflict as well. So that's also why the situation was supported. Now, I wish I could go further about the Syrian situation. We'll pick it up next week when we talk about it. Gonna have some guests coming on pretty soon. We've got 3 candidates to mention before we go here, and that I want to mention activist post raising funds. But 3 candidates. One being Dan Burdorf, running for U.S. Senate in Nebraska. DanForNebraska.com. Dan has not made it onto the ballot, unfortunately, because a lack of ballot signatures. Not a lack of support. There were just some things that were working against Dan, unfortunately, and it didn't pan out. But that's okay. It's a learning experience. Dan's still fighting. Tax Wall Street Party's still fighting, and this was just a minor bump in the road. But DanForNebraska.com. He's running as a write-in candidate. If you're in Nebraska, please go write him in. Go to his website, learn how to spell his name. There's also James Hinton, who's running for the 5th District of the U.S. House of Representatives in California. He's running against Mike Thompson. And James' website is hintonforcongress.com. That's HINTON forcongress.com. Hopefully we'll have James up to talk about his platform as well. James is an anti-GMO candidate, pro-marijuana legalization candidate, pro-gun, pro-taxing Wall Street, pro-nationalizing the Fed, pro-parity agriculture, and many other things, pro-protective tariffs and that sort of thing. And of course we've got Rick Strawcutter running for the 7th Congressional District in Michigan, and his website is rickstrawcutter.com. He, of course, wants to investigate 9/11, wants to investigate chemtrails, he's pro-Second Amendment, he's anti-abortion, and he's on record as saying that he stands with people like Alex Jones and David Icke, so he's worth checking out as well. Now, before we go, we've got to talk about one last thing, and that is Activist Post is trying to raise money to go ad-free. So let me read you this press release here before we go, and hopefully you'll be able to help. It says, "Dear friends, we are excited to announce our plans for a new ad-free platform, but we need your help to launch it. Go to our crowdfunder now and get some cool perks for supporting us." Their crowdfunder is linked in the article. Action alert, we need your help to go ad-free. So go to the article, Action alert, we need your help to go ad-free, and click on the link where it says Our Crowdfunder. When we began this journey 4 years ago to rant about the establishment and curate the most important news of the day, we never imagined that nearly 1 million people would visit our blog each month. Your support has humbled us beyond measure. Yet despite record traffic, our ad revenue is insufficient to advance our mission to promote peace and liberty. The good news is that the Great Awakening is growing exponentially. The bad news is truth-telling doesn't always pay the bills. We started this blog part-time as a maddening itch for truth and justice that had no foundation in prestige or in making money. Today we consider ourselves extremely fortunate to work around the clock to provide a counter to mainstream propaganda and a platform for other independent journalists. However, our income, if broken down hourly, would make a fast food worker blush at their good fortune. It is no mystery what we are up against, a corporate government media machine that continues to expand their desire to shut out dissenting voices and alternative information. They even resort to labeling peaceful activism or political dissent as terrorism, and reading alternative information as potentially becoming radicalized on the internet. Ideas of peace, love, and liberty have great power. In fact, the establishment is scared to death of these ideas taking root. Anyone who desires control over others would naturally be terrified of these principles because they are the precise antidote to their agenda. But they have incredibly vast resources at their disposal, and all we have in independent news is each other, our crowd, our tribe, you. We always envisioned an open source platform that would rise or fall based on the merit of the information and hard work and dedication. However, there are very few ways to make money in open source media and stay true to our principles. We originally chose market-based advertising as our chief source of revenue because it's voluntary, but we know many of you despise the advertisements. But alas, fighting the war of ideas against the established order takes more than passion. It takes action and it takes resources. It takes the crowd support for alternative media to survive and thrive. In the past, we've opposed offering a subscription news service because we believe information this important must be free. But now we clearly see value in offering ad-free experiences. That said, we will always maintain the free version of our website with ads. We know times are tight, so we've priced this subscription as low as possible to be able to bring this new platform to you. Membership in this ad-free community will be $5 per month, or basically like buying one Starbucks coffee per month for our crew. We refuse to back down from our goals. Now we have 45 days to show the establishment that people-powered media means business like never before. As a big thank you, we have put together some exciting perks for helping with this mission. And you can also go to their Indiegogo page, which is linked in the article, and it says, "Thank you from the bottom of our hearts for your support, Activist Post, crew, and staff." And again, to find how you can support them, go to Action Alert. We need your help to go ad-free. Activist Post, pull it up, click on their crowdfunder, their Indiegogo page, and donate. Do whatever you can to help them raise money, subscribe, and all that kind of stuff. But the ad-free version will always be up there, as they say, but it's important to support people who do such good work. So go to their page and click on that article and do what you can to support them. So we're out of time. We got so much more that I wish we could have talked about. Next week we'll try to, in the event of no guests, we may have some guests coming up soon, but next week we'll try to talk about Syria, some domestic stuff, some economic stuff. We'll try to space it out a little bit better next week. So, ladies and gentlemen, thanks for listening tonight. This has been Truth on the Tracks. I'm Brandon Turbeville. We'll see you next week.
Following the House of Representatives and the U.S. Senate's bipartisan support, President Obama's plans to arm and train moderate Syrian rebels, in his speech on Thursday evening, the president thanked senators for their support and said the coalition of countries ready to fight ISIS unites 40 countries. He also unveiled some details on the training of the Syrian opposition.
With this new effort, we'll provide training and equipment to help them grow stronger and take on ISIL terrorists inside Syria. This program will be hosted outside of Syria in partnership with Arab countries, and it will be matched by our increasing support for Iraqi government and Kurdish forces in Iraq.
For more news, visit pigminews.com.
This is Ozzy Skateboard, and you're listening to UC